Hello everyone, thanks for joining SOTAR's first live chat. I'm new at this kind of stuff, so we may not do more of these. We may keep doing them. The internet connection drops in and out depending on where I'm at, so the quality may get pretty bad. So I wanted to take some input from everyone in the group, see what kind of discussions we wanted to cover. Got a good bit of suggestions. Most of them very, very good. Some of them were jokes, which is what I expect. But one of the things that I wanted to discuss was the acronym that the U.S. military uses often, which is the MEAL acronym, M-E-A-L. Some other things that were brought up that we could discuss in future videos if we have some success with this would be the sauce. I guess we could do an episode dedicated just to that. Buffer choice, which Alan Duggar from Spring Code chimed in and gave some good advice. I don't think I'm going to cover buffer choice because that's a topic that I sort of deflect off of, and even in classes, until we get a full overview of what we're dealing with a rifle, pistol, etc. QC issues that I'm seeing on the market, coming through the classes, some stuff that I see across my bench as I do custom work and repairs. Thread concentricity was another good topic. Buffer wear and how to correct it. Ejectors. A little bit of history about me. The history stuff I'm not going to cover because there's a primary and secondary video that I did with Matt Landfair where he focused just on School of the American Rifle, and I gave a good bit of my background and history on there. I really don't like to talk much about myself, so I prefer if people just deflected over to PNS and looked at that video if you wanted to dig in a little bit about my history and my experience, things like that, my credentials, if that type of thing is important to you. What else do we have? Common malfunctions was another good one. That's one of the things that I probably see most commonly asked in different forms of social media, whether it be Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, different gun forums, is malfunctions, how to properly diagnose them, address them, and but I think I'm going to cover MEAL because that covers some of these other questions. I think it's a more all-encompassing topic, and then we can break it down in other videos where we see to get into more details. So the MEAL acronym, the original acronym stands for Quality Magazines, so M, magazine. E stands for, I believe, Ejector. I may be remembering this wrong. I use my my PowerPoint presentation in classes to keep me on task with this. I've added a caveat to that, which is Ejector and Extractor. So instead of E just standing for one of those, I believe that it's important to cover both of those areas, a good extractor assembly and a good ejector assembly. It's not just the ejector or the extractor itself, it's the spring that drives those components. The A acronym in MEAL stands for ammunition. Use quality ammunition, and the L stands for lubrication. Now I did add another portion to that A acronym. Instead of just ammunition, I addressed the action spring, or buffer spring as most people understand it. The action spring is what Colt calls it, but standard action springs don't have a terribly long service life. So those those four things are what you can address out of the gate with a new build, a gun you just purchased. If you're having any kind of issues, that is my my GPS. Whenever the lanes change and it gets confused, it thinks that I'm veering off the street, but I'm not. I'm paying attention to the road. But if you follow those four parts of the acronym, you'll have rather good successes, assuming that your gun, AR specifically, is built properly. And we can go into other details in future videos about that. But magazines is an area where a lot of people sort of get turned sideways. They don't really understand. And this goes into troubleshooting too. If you just have one brand of magazine, this is where having a diversity of magazines is really helpful. So some people will just find a sale on, let's say, PMags, and don't focus on the brands or names that I'm mentioning. I'm just using these as examples. But let's say you buy a bunch of PMags, let's say Gen 2 PMags, and you only have one AR. You go to the range and you start having a massive amount of reliability issues. Most people will automatically assume that it's the gun, or they'll assume that it's the magazine. You need to diversify, because some lower receivers, some AR build combinations, whether it be the tolerances between the upper, lower, slop within the bolt carrier, there's all types of small little variables that can add up. Even things like the feed ramps cannot cooperate with certain types of magazines when you combine it with a particular brand or a lower. Now again, that's not targeting a particular brand, and I'm not saying Magpul magazines are bad at all. I have them in my personal supply. Fantastic magazines, but sometimes Magpul mags don't work with some gun combinations. The same thing with other brands. Sometimes USGI type magazines don't work with some gun combinations. Sometimes Lancers don't work. And I could keep going on. Those are the three more popular types though. But another thing that people do beyond not diversifying with magazines, and the diversification allows you to sort of pick and choose which one of your ARs prefers which types of magazines you like. And sometimes you can have great success with all brands of magazines with whatever ARs you have, and you don't have any compatibility or sensitivity issues. But you should number your magazines. This comes down to troubleshooting. So if you number your magazines or label them in some way, you get two things out of that. Number one, you get to identify your magazines at your own. So if you're taking a training class, you're at a shooting range, you're at a buddy's house and there's other people shooting, people are dumping their magazines on the deck, it allows you to identify which magazines are yours. So it's really important to make sure that you not only identify your magazines for saying that they're yours if there's a mix-up with other people shooting, but it also allows you, if you can number them, it allows you to identify whether or not you have issues with the magazine or the firearm you're shooting with that magazine. So if you go to the range one day and you have 5 magazines, and they're labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you decide that this malfunction that you had is a gun issue. Maybe it's an ammunition issue. If you had a malfunction with magazine number 3, and you clear that malfunction, you continue shooting throughout that day, and then you have another magazine or a possible magazine related malfunction, and it's magazine number 5, you can almost conclude, since you had 2 separate magazines that had issues, that it's probably not the magazines. Maybe it's compatibility with that brand or generation of mags with your gun, but it's probably either the ammunition or the weapon itself. Now, if you had a malfunction with magazine number 1, and then later on you had another magazine another malfunction and it was magazine number 1, then you can probably conclude that the magazine number 1 in question is the issue, and sort of isolate it and try to figure out, okay, well, it's not my gun that's the problem, it's the magazine. Or maybe it's the ammunition. But it gives you a little bit better idea of how to troubleshoot and deal with what may be the underlying issue. So diversification with magazines, you need to compare them. I normally take the lower receiver off of the upper, and I'll insert magazines. I could probably do a better video about this instead of me just doing a live chat. But insert them into the lower receiver with the upper off, and look at how the magazine catch or the bolt catch interfaces with the follower. If it doesn't have good contact, you may have a sensitivity issue with certain brands of magazines. This live chat is going to sort of go sideways here in a second because I'm in the Chick-fil-A drive-thru. I'm hungry and I need to get breakfast. So while I'm waiting on there, the questions already. Discuss your hair care products. I can't even. Phil is saying Duke, Cannon, or Bust. Phil, you're speaking a different language there, my friend. I can't understand. All right, I'm pulling up now. They're gonna get my order. Stand by, fellas and ladies.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Okay.
Can I get the breakfast burrito with chicken?
Okay, do you want the meal?
No, just the burrito.
Okay.
I'd like to get an orange juice and a large Coke.
Okay. Now a name for the order?
Chad.
Chad.
Yes.
Alright, it's 926, just slide right across the top. And you're off with the full forward.
Thank you. My morning fix of hate chicken. Alright, Kane saying, what number guard do you use for your... I don't know, the one that I like. I guess it's the second one, Kane. You have the one that's really like no guard at all, and then you have the really, really short one, and then the next one up, and I just hit it. We're not talking about AR stuff, though. I guess I can read some of this while we're in the drive-thru. 5W20 for my hair. Nah, that's too slippery. I tend to go light on the lube when it comes to my hair. My wife would have to answer the question about what hair product that I use. It's one that I get from the haircut place. I don't know. You put it in dry hair. Yes, the sauce is the boss. Good one, Kingsley. Alright, well, back to finishing up my thoughts on magazines. Just try to diversify with them. Buy a little bit of Lancers, a little bit of Magpuls, a little bit of GIs. If you want to get into some more exotic stuff like some H&K magazines, there's various generations of those. Just get a little bit of everything. See what you like, number one. Sometimes a magazine pouch that you have may not be the best use for certain magazines. Maybe it snags. Maybe particular magazines that you have don't drop free from your magazine well. You can have all kinds of issues. Like I said, feed ramps could be one problem. If the feed ramp geometry is wrong, some magazines present the projectile at a higher angle, and they have better success feeding in guns that maybe not have perfect feed ramp geometry. So, the E acronym for meal. Ejector and Extractor. Like I said, the original acronym uses one or the other. I like to use both for this particular topic. It's important to have not only a good spring for your ejector, but also to make sure that the ejector moves freely, and I prefer to see a slight bevel. The TDP shows in the print that the ejector should have a slight bevel on it. I do a modification in classes where we put a little bit more of a dramatic 45-degree bevel on it. I have heard people say that there are documents that the U.S. military have compiled through testing to show that a drastic bevel on the ejector allows debris to get into the ejector tunnel. I've never seen that through my testing. I'm not going to dismiss that because I always consider myself a perpetual student. But through the numerous rifles that I've modified, worked on, repaired, I've never seen that to be an issue regardless of round count. So maybe there was other factors in those military tests. Even if those military tests exist, I can't confirm or deny that. I've never seen any documentation. I've just been told that. But I prefer to see a very slight bevel on the ejector, and make sure the spring has some authority behind it and it moves freely, no binding, no grittiness. Sometimes when manufacturers put the ejector assembly together, the roll pin specifically, they'll raise the burr up or they'll chip a piece of the ejector off, and it'll cause a burr inside the ejector tunnel, and that can cause reliability issues. Just random stuff where you have weird ejection patterns, or sometimes it fails to eject when the gun gets a little hot or dirty, things like that. The next part about the E acronym is the extractor. So the extractor, it should have a nice sharp claw on it. The hook that grabs the casing should be nice and sharp. It needs to be able to move freely. Some aftermarket style coatings can make the extractor bore where the pin rides smaller than it should be, and it actually causes the pin that it should seesaw on to bind up, either in the bolt itself or in the ejector tunnel. The bore for that pin, that is. So just make sure that things move freely. If you've ever watched any of my AR bolt carrier physicals, you'll see me sometimes putting the pin on the extractor and spinning it freely. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for free movement. The next part about the extractor assembly, beyond free movement and a good claw, comes down to using a good quality spring. There's only two brands of springs that I will use in my personally owned ARs. I'm not saying that if you don't follow this advice, you're going to get killed in the streets, anything like that. I'm just saying I've had great success using these two particular brands of extractor springs. Number one, which is my secondary pick, this is not my first pick, the number one that I'm going to mention, which is the second pick, and that's a little confusing, is the Colt extractor spring. It's gold in color. They've made several generations over the years. There's different color inserts. There's different amounts of coils, different thickness in the coils, but the current generation of Colt extractor springs are gold in color. those springs are actually one of the best standard springs on the market in my experience. You only want to use the rubber insert, or as Alan from Spring Co calls it, the mouse turd, which I think is hilarious. You don't want to use the donut or the O-ring along with that insert. The reason being is because that generation of spring has enough extractor tension or load to properly extract on a gun, unless there's something severely wrong with it, where you have a gun that's grossly overgassed, maybe you have chamber issues, maybe you're underbuffered or undersprung. But if your gun isn't really off, a standard Colt gold extractor spring will serve you with just the insert. Do not try to use the O-ring unless you're dealing with some odd combination or an odd issue with the gun. Those springs don't have that long a service life, though. They last anywhere between 7,000 and 15,000 rounds, depending on the gas system, things that it's exposed to. But they are a rather good factory style spring. They'll run you between $4 and $6 depending on where you get them. My favorite springs are made by Alan from Spring Co. He sells a 4-coil spring and a 5-coil spring. Now Alan has his own standards for what he recommends as far as what should you use the 4-coil in and what should you use the 5-coil in. My personal experience is I prefer to use the 4-coil in pretty much everything except for carbine and pistol length gas systems. I'm not a fan of pistol length gas systems unless you're using it for something like a 300 blackout, but if you have it, that's where I believe, in my experience, the 5-coil shines. Sometimes you can actually have too much extractor tension or load, where it can cause issues for the gun to go in the battery if it's running sluggish. It can shave material off of the rim of the casing and cause all kinds of debris to be in the gun. But sometimes too much spring or too much extractor tension can be a bad thing. And the same thing can be said for the ejector too. If you try to have some massively strong spring for the ejector, you can run into problems when it comes to getting the gun to go in the battery. Speaking of the ejector spring, which I skipped over, the only spring that I prefer to use for ejectors is Spring Co. spring. So Alan's ejector spring is the only one that I trust. When it comes to extractor, my preferred is, I'm at my window.
Dad,
Yes.
how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Thank you very much.
That's your medicine?
You too. Sorry, everyone. But extractor spring, I like the 4-coil in most of the setups. Like I said, mid-length, rifle length, I prefer the 4-coil. For carbine and pistol length gas, I prefer the 5-coil, and I only use the insert or the O-ring with that application as well. If you have to use, generally speaking, if you're not using the Colt spring or you're not using a Spring Co spring, and you have to use the insert and the donut, normally that means that they're trying to mask or put a band-aid over a poor quality spring. Now, this rule, when it comes to springs of mine, applies with the extractor specifically. I have a test for the ejector that I use in classes, but the extractor spring is the only spring on the gun that I've never developed a test for. So my rule for extractor springs is, if you don't know the age of it, if you don't know the provenance of it, who made it, where it came from, then replace that spring as a form of insurance. It's a $5 to $6 part depending on who you buy it from. So if you don't know who made your extractor spring, put a new one in there. And out of those two choices, you have Colt, which is my second choice, or Spring Co, which is my first choice. The Spring Co springs have a much longer service life when it comes to the ejector and the extractor. The Spring Co extractor springs could easily last 50,000 rounds if you don't allow them to get corroded. The ejector spring can be the same way. The standard non-Spring Co ejector springs, I've seen those give up in as few as 5,000 rounds, depending on who makes them and depending on the tolerances of the bolt itself, the ejector tunnel specifically. If they drill it too deep, or if there's some rough finishing done, then it can actually wear at the spring as the gun's trying to function. So it's important. Don't let your springs corrode. This is what comes into proper lubrication. That's a separate part of the acronym. But good extractor springs, good ejector springs, and make sure that those extractors and ejectors function as they're supposed to. My mouth is dry. So, next part of the acronym. what we got? We got M covered, we got E covered. A, ammunition, and I also have an acronym for there for action spring. So let's cover the action spring. Another thing that most people may or may not be aware of, and it depends on who makes the spring. There is a length spec for springs, and there is a solid height test you can do for springs, which isn't mentioned in military manuals, but it's something that I do. And I actually have a video on YouTube addressing those two things, what to look for with length and solid height. But you need to look at service life. A standard spring, let's say you buy a gun from Colt, standard buffer spring, action spring, service life can be as few as 5,000 rounds. Now, that's not to say that the gun will be completely unreliable, but based on what type of ammunition you're using, how much port erosion you have on a particular gun, things can change based on that erosion in the gas port, based on the ammunition you use, and a particular spring with a very short amount of rounds on it can start giving you odd issues, or what I refer to as ghosts in the gun. So keep an eye on your buffer spring, your action spring. There's only really two companies that I use. I would bring up a third one. It's not a bad one, but it has a very limited use. But there are two types of springs that I use. My number one pick, and I'm mentioning it first, is Springco springs. So that depending on whether you have a rifle or a carbine buffer system, you have a green spring that you could use for the rifle systems, or a standard spring, which Allen does not make that I'm aware of. And then for carbines, you have a wide variety of springs to choose from, which are also various color-coded for carbine buffer systems. I like that because it gives you a wide range of tunability for your particular gun. And every gun can behave a little bit differently based on the efficiency of the gas system and other factors such as ammunition, suppressor, even things like lubrication, types of coatings on your bolts. All those little things can add up and change the recipe. And I use the term recipe often in courses. That's something that I picked up from Jim Hodge, from Hodge Defense. I think it's a perfect analogy when it comes to the modern AR-15 because so many people make parts for it. It really is a recipe. A lot of people assume that gauging is silly and certain inspection processes that I do is silly, and that's fine if you don't adopt that. But what I believe is important is understanding how components work together. So if I gauge an individual part and it falls outside of TDP range or mil-spec range, it doesn't necessarily mean that part's bad. You can have another part that falls outside of range on the opposite extreme, and when they mesh, they are perfectly in spec when they marry to one another. So I don't always get focused on what an individual part gauges at. It has to do with the overall recipe. And if one part of the recipe is off, you can tweak the recipe to make it right. But that being said, when it comes to buffer springs, Springcos are my personal choice. They have extremely long service life. Those can go up to 500,000 cycles based on the testing that I've observed. My personal experiences, I've never seen one fail unless you expose it to certain things like corrosive ammunition or corrosive elements. So if you store your AR on a boat and you take it out on salt water every single day and you don't address the protectant on that spring or the proper lubrication in your gun, you will kill that spring in very short order. The same thing with corrosive ammunition. I had a video not too long ago where a user actually broke his Springco spring into several pieces, and after further analysis they found out that the ammunition was corrosive. So the gases that were pushed back into the system, into the buffer assembly, actually just rested on the spring and eventually ate at it and caused it to fail. But you can kill a really good spring like a Springco, even they have a long service life. So keep an eye on things, keep them properly protected and lubricated, and they'll give you a good service life. If your buffer has a protruding roll pin that's dramatic on the buffer, it can actually eat at the inside of even very good quality springs, and it can reduce the service life of those springs. So just keep an eye on things like that. The next pick would be sort of a nuanced spring, and that is the tub flat wire spring. They make three different versions. They make a 300 blackout spring, they make an AR-15 spring, and then they make an AR-10 or large frame AR spring. One of the positives about the flat wire springs, and they're also can be very finicky, is that you can actually clip them to length. So if you get one, you get a standard tub spring, and these don't have a spec measurement, so you can't pull out a tape measure and say, okay, this spring is good and bad based on measurements. but the good thing about them is they don't go to solid height. You can actually clip them. You only clip one end. You put the clipped end towards the rear of the buffer tube, but you can clip them, and they don't lose enough of their initial preload to cause problems. So you can tune one that is actually too strong for a particular application to your gun. I don't think most users should do that, so that's not something I'm recommending you do. But as a simplicity application, you can buy one spring and then make it suit that particular gun, where with other springs, let's say spring coat, you have a pretty wide variety of carbine springs, and you may be picking the wrong one if you don't buy all of them. I prefer to tell people, if you're looking to find out what works best in your gun as far as the spring coat goes, buy all of the ones for the buffer application you're using, and then do your own fine tuning. But the flat wire springs, they don't go to solid height. They can be a pain to install and remove. That's one of the caveats about them. They also can fail if you allow them to corrode. But they're also very sensitive to the inside finish of the buffer or receiver extension, buffer tube or receiver extension. So if you have a really rough buffer tube or receiver extension, then you can have issues where the flat wire spring, since it has more surface area, it can actually cause cycling issues. So you have to be very aware of the inner dimensions of the inside of your buffer tube, and you have to make sure that if it is a little bit rough, that you need to add sufficient lubrication to overcome that friction that it causes. I'm not saying that the flat wires are the optimal choice. I normally reserve those for things like blowback 9mm ARs, and large frame guns. I generally do not put them in like AR-15 standard, standard ARs. So if you're shooting 5.56, then I would use Springco springs. If I was shooting a large frame AR, something like 308 or 6.5 Creedmoor, then I may consider something like a flat wire AR-10 style spring. Things like 300 Blackout tend to do very well with the flat wire springs too, because their 300 Blackout spring is tailored specifically to work really good with subsonic and supersonic loads. But it's not the only spring that works with 300 Blackout, so don't get too focused on that. But it's a good diagnostics tool to have in your toolbox if you're looking to actually squeeze out the most reliability out of your gun. But back to the initial A part of the acronym, which is ammunition. You need to also have some diversity there. Think of this the same way you do with magazines. And one of the biggest problems I have with ammunition, and don't take this the wrong way, guys, reloaders. Some reloaders can be very, very tribal or closed-minded when it comes to their reloads. I always tell people, when you're doing your initial troubleshooting, your initial break-in of your gun, initial testing of your gun, shoot factory ammunition, not remanufactured ammunition, not your own reloads, not your buddy's reloads, not Jimmy Joe Bob's from over the hill. Shoot factory quality ammunition, not little bags of ammunition that you bought from the gun show in a little Ziploc bag that you don't know what's what. Factory ammunition. If it's some unknown off-the-wall brand that you've never heard of and you have to ask people on the internet about it, don't use that for troubleshooting. Don't use that for testing. But factory ammunition. I cannot tell you how many times as a gunsmith users would bring their firearms into my shop that I worked at and say my gun won't work. I'd go into the back, into the test trap, put factory ammunition and empty magazines through the gun. And they were like, what did you do to the gun? Nothing. I cleared it, made sure that there wasn't a bore obstruction. I put factory ammunition in it and I shot it and it worked fine. Reloads can be very temperamental depending on the gun you're using, and especially auto-loading gas guns. You have to do things just right. And just because ammunition works on one of your ARs that you loaded doesn't mean it's going to work on another, depending on how you size your brass, all types of things. Seating depth. It can cause ammunition that you load to be very sensitive to certain guns. So that doesn't mean that you suck if your ammunition doesn't work. It just means that you need to do a little bit more tweaking for a particular gun that you're trying to make your ammo work for. So never troubleshoot with reloaded ammunition. If you need me to help you with troubleshooting with something, I don't allow reloaded ammunition to be part of my troubleshooting procedure because I've had too many guns blow up on me. I don't trust other people's reloads. And you can have bad things happen with factory ammunition, but at least with factory ammunition, if you have the lot and the box that you shot it from, you can at least have some legal recourse or some customer service recourse. customer service recourse with something that blows up and damages you or your firearm or whatever. So factory ammunition, but diversify. Don't go just because ammunition is hard to find, and it is right now. Don't go buy a pallet of ammunition from one particular company, because you may just buy a complete pallet full of junk. Again, try to diversify. Different projectile weights, different manufacturers. You could even try to mix it up and see if your particular gun will reliably shoot steel case ammunition or brass case ammunition. Brass will generally be more reliable. That doesn't mean that steel will blow you up or anything like that, but brass case ammunition is more reliable when it comes to the AR-15. So diversify your ammunition. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. The last part is lubrication. This is where we get into gun lubes, alternative lubes. We've created a nickname for the lubrication that I make. They call it SOTAR, but it's essentially synthetic motor oil and synthetic wheel bearing grease mixed together to a very thin grade grease, or a thin viscosity grease. The reason that I prefer to use that is because a thin grease stays put better on an AR than an oil does. The documents aren't publicly available, but Aberdeen Proving Grounds many years ago, I think it was over 10 years ago now, did some extensive testing with the M4 system. You could call it the AR-15 still, but the M4. They used brand new weapons. They used weapons that had been in service for a moderate amount of time, ones that had been in service for a good amount of time, and they conducted all types of environmental tests, whether it be pressure, altitude, temperature, exposure to sand, dust, mud. They supposedly imported soil samples from all over the globe. And what they found is, under all conditions, the AR family of weapons, the M4 specifically in this test, worked better with heavy lubrication than moderate or light lubrication or none. Now that throws some people into a complete tailspin. They're like, well, I fought overseas. If you heavily lubricated your gun, then it works like it collects dust like a sugar cookie. Lubrication doesn't attract dust. Dust will stick to it, sand will stick to it. But if you have a sufficient amount of lubrication, I prefer to use the generous term, generous amount of lubrication, it works as a medium to displace fouling. The AR-15 weapon has, depending on how you're shooting it, what kind of ammunition, suppressed or not, can have what I refer to as a positive pressure system. So that means that if there's an excessive amount of fouling inside the action, inside of the bolt carrier group, the parts that actually slide back and forth, and you have generous lubrication on the gun, you can end up having the pressure coming from the chamber and from the gas system to actually help displace or vent some of that fouling and contaminants out of the way of critical moving surfaces. If the gun's not lubricated properly, or it has no lubrication at all, it tends not to want to move those fouling pieces out of the way, or those contaminants out of the way. So generous lubrication will give you better reliability results. Pat Rogers, who passed away several years ago, was one of the pioneers to sort of break the mold of going too crazy on maintenance and the amount of lubrication. People would ask him often, what type of lube should I use in my gun? And Pat would always say yes. His answer was yes, because he didn't care what kind of lubrication you used in your gun as long as it had lubrication on it and it had a sufficient amount of lubrication. So use a generous amount of lubrication. You don't want to lube inside the chamber and in the bore, but everywhere in the gun, generous lube is a good thing. He used Slip 2000, if I remember correctly. And a lot of people prefer to use gun-specific lubricants. And if that's what you prefer to use, then that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. My GPS thinks that I'm too close to the tractor trailer in front of me. But I'm not. It doesn't matter if you use gun-based lubricants or if you use your own lubricant. The thing that I try to teach most specifically is that you need to understand the temperature range that the lubricant that you're using is capable of working in your gun. So let's say you live in Texas you live in Florida, places that get hot and stay hot generally. Now there are some anomalies that can change that lubrication you use, but you can get away with thicker lubes in hot operating environments because it won't congeal and gum up and get too thick. If you live in an area that's cold most of the time, or it gets very cold depending on the season, then you need to be very, very much aware that a lubricant that is too thick or applied too heavy in certain areas can cause problems. So regardless if you make your own SOTAR lubricant and you mix it up, or you use a gun-based lubricant, test it out. Make sure that it works in the environment or climate that you live in. It can give you all kinds of problems. Stupid GPS again. It can give you all kinds of problems depending on the temperature you're dealing with. So just because you use a gun-based lubricant that has said it's good to -20 doesn't mean that it isn't going to give you problems at 20 degrees, let alone -20. But test it out. If you can securely lock it in a vehicle or in a place that you can expose it to cold temperatures, maybe you have a garage that's not climate controlled, let it get as cold as possible and try to keep it at that temperature, and then take it and shoot it, whether it's a range that you go to or in your backyard if you have the space and place to do that. But test out the lubricant that you use. Don't blindly trust something just because it's called a gun lubricant. Don't blindly trust your own home-based brew. Treat it with doubt and prove it out. Make it prove itself to you. But the amount of lubrication you use can be the difference in having a reliable gun or one that gives you all kinds of problems. Most of the time when people would bring me guns, when it came to malfunctions or people that come to classes, they haven't followed these 4 portions of the MEAL acronym. They're using one particular brand of magazines. They're using junk ammunition. They haven't looked at the extractor or ejector assembly. Their buffer spring is probably something that they don't even know who made it. And they're using marginal ammunition, and they don't have any lubrication on the gun. But if you take those steps, even if you have a gun that's not right, in most circumstances you can have a reasonable amount of success with reliability on the AR if you follow those things within that acronym. When it comes to extractor springs, most people get really sideways or get their tail into a twist when I say that I replace springs out of factory guns. So let's say I buy a brand new, and again, I'm not trashing this particular company, I'm just using it as an example. Let's say I buy a brand new BCM bolt carrier group. I immediately rip out the ejector spring and the extractor spring and I put a spring co in. Does that mean that BCM makes trash? No. But I have had odd instances where I have had problems with BCM springs. Does that mean that you need to go out and take my word as absolute gospel and change out all your springs? No. I'm just conveying what I do based on my experience. But unless the company who makes the bolt, or the bolt carrier group, if you bought it as an assembly, tells you who makes the spring and you can verify that it is the spring that you're hoping to use in there, treat it with doubt. Replace the springs. Those ejector and extractor springs are very important for reliability, and they're cheap insurance by just replacing them out of the gate. So that's my recommendation there. Got a little bit more of a drive left for work, so I've covered those things. I don't think I can really read the screen very well, but let me see, based on my notes that I have. The SOTAR salts we talked a little bit about, but hey, what the heck, let's talk about that a little bit. The SOTAR sauce. I have a video that talks about how to make it. The reason that I make it, and I talk about it in the video, for my own use, is because I lube generously. So if I take that same mindset and I apply it with other gun-based lubricants, I go through a lot of lubricant that costs a lot of money. And the SOTAR lubricant, depending on the viscosity that you make it to, works on par with most gun-based lubricants. And it exceeds a lot of them. And a lot of people get really bent out of shape about that. and think that I'm telling them that they have to follow my advice. If you like the gun lubricant that you use, continue to use it. As long as you apply it sufficiently, it should not give you any problems. Now, some gun lubes can be very sensitive to mixing with other lubricants. So let's say you use a bio-based lubricant. Let's say you use frog lube. Let's say you use something like Fire Clean or Ran CLP, and you don't have enough of it on the firearm, and you take a class or whatever, you forgot to bring lubricant, someone has something else, and you mix it with something that is petroleum based, it may not react properly. It may gum up or congeal and cause reliability problems. Certain bio-based lubes can also oxidize and become corrosive if you let them sit. So they can have the opposite effect if you don't stay on top of them. Some people are adamant about using bio-based lubes and say that if you use gun or non-gun based lubricants, let's say you use automotive lubricants on your gun, that you run a risk of getting things like cancer, things like that. You can inhale things. The reality is regardless of whether you use a bio-based lubricant or use an automotive-based lubricant, shooting a firearm releases things like lead, metals, things like that, that aren't necessarily safe. So when you're maintaining your gun, you should use gloves. But if you're using some, let's say, I'm going to joke a little bit about it. I'm going to say that you're using some, unicorn hippie lube, and it's bio-based, and it's made of, the most exotic vegan plants. It may be great when it's in its virgin state, but once it's contaminated with firing residue from your firearm, unless you're shooting some type of green ammunition that doesn't have any negative contaminants that's shut off from the firing sequence, then you're basically chasing your tail, because your uber hippie lube is going to get contaminated with firing residue, and if you don't use gloves when you're doing maintenance, you're not doing yourself any service. So regardless whether you use an automotive-based lube, a gun lube, or some I'm joking, hippie lube, use gloves when you're maintaining your gun. Shooting isn't necessarily a safe thing, even when you follow a safety protocol. If you've ever talked to anybody that works at like a shooting range, when they do cleaning and stuff, they pretty much put hazmat suits on when they're doing maintenance because of the stuff that's downrange and in the baffles and such. So shooting can cause other health problems, and this is not medical advice, but just be aware when you're shooting. Don't be putting your hands in your mouth. Wash your hands before you eat. Things like that. Just be reasonable about it. So when people get really twisted up about using automotive products on a firearm, I don't understand that, because shooting in general exposes you to some pretty nasty stuff if you don't take certain safety protocols. So regardless of what you use to lubricate your gun, just be smart about how you deal with firing residue and contaminants and ingesting them, inhaling them, things like that. When it comes to the SOTAR, the heavier lubes tend to vaporize or aerosol less when the gun's operating. They stay put, where oils tend to either sling off or shed from certain coatings. They evaporate due to the solvents in the lubricant, or if it's a CLP-based product. But it can cause you issues using too thin viscosity of a lubricant on an AR. So those things being said, use what you like, but use enough of it, and just be careful when you're doing your maintenance. Too much lube is almost enough. Done. I don't know if I'm doing a good job here, guys and gals. I guess I'll find out after the video's over. I'm not too far from work. My burrito is still warm, so that's good. I think overall the video for our first one was not bad. I like to hear everyone's feedback, and the commentary we had from the announcement of making this video, I'm not going to forget. So we will talk about things like minimizing buffer damage, how to address it, QC issues that I see, but I think I'd like to not ramble on in this video. I'd like to try to keep my videos, if I'm going to do this in the future, about a half hour long. I don't like to ramble, even on my autopsy and physical videos. I also don't like to be the subject, so this type of video makes me extremely uncomfortable. I like the subject matter to be the focus. But we'll see if this has enough popularity to justify keep doing it. But I appreciate everybody watching, and thanks for keeping me company on my short drive to one of my full-time jobs. And I'll talk to you soon.